Welcome to the 31st Annual George A. Miller Distinguished Lecture. I'm Ron Mangan, and it's my honor and great pleasure to introduce this year's recipient of the George A. Miller Prize, Dr. Ken Paller, Professor of Psychology at Northwestern University. There he holds the James Padilla Chair in Arts and Science and serves as the Director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Program and of the training program in the Neurosciences of Human Cognition. Dr. Paller began his scientific career at UCLA, where he received his bachelor's degree in psychobiology. He then earned his Ph.D. in neuroscience at UC San Diego. At UCSD, he worked with Larry Squire, Stuart Zola Morgan, and Steve Hilliard on an immensely challenging and important effort to develop an animal model of human cognitive ERPs, an incredible project that he devised and led as a doctoral student, including the building of the laboratory to do the work. No pressure on you students out there. Dr. Paller then pursued a series of postdocs, first with Greg McCarthy and Chris Wood at Yale, and then with the late and greatly missed Andrew R. Mays at the University of Manchester in the UK, with Marta Kudis at UC San Diego as a McDonald Pew Fellow, and finally at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory with Bill Jagist and the late and much beloved Art Shimamura, who was one of the founders of this society. Professor Paller then joined the Faculty of Psychology at Northwestern in 1994, and to the great joy and luck of his colleagues, he remains there today. Dr. Paller's published over 200 scientific papers and chapters in top-ranked journals, including in Science, PNAS, Nature Neuroscience, Neuron, and most importantly, the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. Dr. Paller's illustrious career spans more than 4 decades, during which his research has focused on understanding conscious memory experiences and the ways in which memory operations differ in the absence of an awareness of retrieval, such as in the cases of implicit memory and intuition. His research has also linked memory deficits to poor sleep and shown that memory processing during sleep supports daytime learning. Dr. Paller's investigations to elucidate the critical contributions of sleep to cognition are leading to novel ideas about strategies to improve sleep and treat various disorders. In recognition of his many career contributions, he's received important awards and honors, including an NINDS First Award, the Senator Mark Hatfield Award from the Alzheimer's Disease Association, and election as a Fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. In recognition of the exciting and groundbreaking directions his research is taking, last year in 2024, he received the coveted National Institutes of Health Directors Pioneer Award. These are given in order to, and I quote, support scientists with outstanding records of creativity pursuing new research directions to develop pioneering approaches to major challenges in biomedical, social sciences, and behavioral research. Professor Paller is also a dedicated teacher and a mentor to doctoral and postdoctoral scholars and early career scientists, activities that he deeply values. This year, we honor him with the 31st Annual George A. Miller Prize and invite him to accept the award and present the George A. Miller Lecture. Please help me welcome Professor Ken Paller.
Hey, buddy. Beautiful. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, for those kind words, and thank you to the Cognitive Neuroscience Society for this wonderful award, and thank you all for being here. Ron didn't quite mention, but Ron and I were lab mates in graduate school at UCSD, and that was an important time working in the same lab. It was such a fun time, and there was a lot of camaraderie among the students, Marty and Gary also here. It was really a critical time for me discovering a community, other people with a shared passion for the scientific exploration of the human mind. And I'm particularly thankful to the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. Many of you might not have realized that there was a time when there was not a Cognitive Neuroscience Society. And Ron was an ERPer studying attention. I was an ERPer studying memory. And then with the society, we then had a bigger community to join with people using lots of different methods and approaches. It really enriched our work in ERPs. Now, you've all heard the line, it's not research, it's me-search. But I have a better one. Actually, what it is we-search, because it's really about friends, community, scientific societies, and of course, especially a lab populated by incredible students. I have roughly 30 years of names here. You might recognize some of them, but photos are more fun, so here's some photos from the past of the lab group at various times. And I can say nothing is achieved single-handedly. It's all really based on groups of people, even though I'm getting this award. So I've been very fortunate with the students who happen to find their way to my lab. Here's some more of them, and some other photos. And I have even a more recent photo. This next one's from last night's celebration with a group of my current students and former students all coming together. It's really great to see everybody. Special thanks to Joel Voss and Charan Ranganath for organizing it. And it's great to find out about what your students are doing and their career advancement and all the wonderful things they've done. It's really the best, with potentially one exception, when your students, Charan and Joel, form their own rock and roll band and invite you to be part of it. That's really special. A good thing too. In this photo, there are also two incredibly critical lab group members, Bruce and Susan. I've been very lucky to have great people in the lab helping to make it work, helping to run it. And Susan, in particular, was in an amazing number of those prior photos, because actually it's been a quarter of a decade where she's been the key person making the lab function. She knows all the science and all the strategies for getting things done. She really deserves a few PhDs by now for all that. And as everyone knows, they're valuable staff people behind the successes of any lab, sometimes coming from indirect costs, very important part of what we do. And there's another face in nearly every one of the prior photos, and that's the love of my life, Marcia Grabowecki. She has her own lab to run, but she's also been a fundamental force behind everything in mind. Sometimes I have a question, I ask Siri or ask Google, but in fact, I can ask Marcy and she almost always knows the answer. Or else she's telling me maybe I'm better off not asking that question, I should stop worrying about that, whatever it is. Plus Marcy, our two sons, Devin and Jackson, who are here, and a wider family. It's so helpful to have a supportive family for this kind of work. And I have actually more thank yous, but it's time to get going to the topic of sleep. So let's start talking about sleep. I want to talk about sleep. Actually, I want to talk about your sleep. So can you tell me by show of hands, how many of you slept really well last night? Raise your hand if you slept well. Oh, it's a good number. Not everyone. So some of you didn't raise your hand, and maybe you didn't get good sleep. But how do we know that really? I suppose if you wake up really refreshed, that could be a sign of good sleep, but that's not all there is to it. There's a lot of benefits of sleep, as I'm going to discuss. And you might think, well, if I had 7 hours, if my sleep tracker said I got 8 hours, that must be good. But maybe we don't all need the same amount of sleep. Maybe, in fact, it really depends not on the number of hours, but on what our brain's doing during that time. So that's what we need to think about. This question is really still answered. What does it mean to have high-quality sleep? What is it about high quality that really benefits us? And I'm interested in the individual level of how we benefit. And there's also a benefit in cognitive neuroscience, because cognitive neuroscience hasn't traditionally been about sleep cognition much at all. There's cognitive neuroscience, and as I mentioned, the ERP research community benefited a lot by becoming part of cognitive neuroscience, and the sleep research and the dream research communities are kind of separate, but really now there's a lot of opportunities for forming connections. And if you noticed all the other talks earlier today pertaining to sleep, it's really quite an incredible change. I think there's great opportunities here. If you want to understand sleep cognition, it's really helpful to take advantage of all the expertise of studying wake cognition and seeing them go together. So the cognitive neuroscience community is really a great one for this sort of work to be featured rather than separately isolated amongst sleep researchers. If you look at the amount of research that's done in cognitive neuroscience pertaining to sleep over the last 30 years, it kind of maybe looks like this. There's a lot of work on wake cognition, not very much on sleep cognition, but it's starting to increase. And I think that kind of makes sense. Sleep is, after all, about 1/3 of our lives. But even more importantly than that, there are these bidirectional connections. So you will know certainly what you do in your waking life is going to influence what kind of sleep you get. And perhaps even more importantly, what happens during sleep has a strong influence on our waking life. And that's what I want to delve in a bit more today. How does that actually play out? So everyone knows sleep is important. You have 3 top things, right? Good nutrition, good exercise, and good sleep. These are important things for health. And yet, probably a lot of you aren't getting good sleep every night, even though you know it's so important. And so we have to sort of figure out what to do with that. There are many reasons not to get good sleep. I suppose there might just be too many things to do during the day, so something has to go so you don't get enough sleep. Or maybe there are other life pressures. But this is problematic because of the lack of sleep is a contributing factor for many diseases, contributes to traffic accidents. It's a problem for society if people aren't getting enough sleep. It might not be your fault. I mean, sometimes there's just not the possibility, or you might have a sleep disorder. For example, do some of you have insomnia that eats into your sleep sometimes? That's a problem, and we're, in my lab, starting to work on that. That's one of the new topics we're looking at. Another problem that's very common is sleep apnea, respiratory issues. A lot of people don't even know they have that, and that has very severe impacts on sleep and health, and is another topic we're looking at. So a couple posters that'll be on tomorrow, James and Erica will be talking about both of those, the problems with insomnia and sleep apnea that we're now approaching in our work. So I'm going to have my talk kind of lead up to, eventually at the end, why it makes sense that we're studying such different things now that seem far removed from memory. And Gabriella and Daniel will also be presenting posters on dreaming, and we're looking at dreaming to think, how can that help us with these same sort of issues of improving sleep and the health benefits? So let's talk about those benefits of good sleep. The most obvious one is if you get good sleep, you're less sleepy. That almost seems circular. That's just kind of a bizarre thing that we would sleep to be less sleepy. But that's a key benefit. But there are lots of other health benefits. I've listed them here: immune function, cardiovascular function, and so on. These are very important. They're not what I'm going to emphasize in my talk, though. Right now, I want to focus on the cognitive benefits. So there's memory, there's problem solving and creativity, and psychological well-being. Those are all sort of tied up with memory. So I've been studying memory since I started at UCSD, and that's sort of a critical feature of how I've been thinking about what's happening during sleep. So we want to sort of figure out how we can understand how do these benefits arise, and then be in a position to try to enhance them and correct them when they're not working right. So some of you might be lucky and you have perfect sleep sometimes. You just have your head hit the pillow, and the next thing you know, you wake up, and it's like your brain was off that whole time. But we all know your brain is not off. Your brain is very busy, even if it seems like no time passed when you wake up. And so we have these questions then. What's all that work that your brain's doing? And why don't we know about it? Why are we kind of oblivious to this processing overnight that happens? And one of the answers is something I like to call sleep amnesia. And you can think of it this way. We have many dreams every night, and if we wake you up at the right time, different times during the night, you'll tell us about your dreams, but many people don't report any dreams or very few dreams. So we have these dreams, we don't remember them the next day, and that's because perhaps our brain is in a state of not encoding new information, but rather working with existing information, and those might be not exactly compatible. So we're really having this sleep amnesia for not acquiring new information. Even there's something called a momentary awakening, a micro-arousal that happens many times for a few seconds or a little longer. We're oblivious to those. We don't realize we have those because we're just not storing information in that way. Now, as Ron mentioned, my earlier work was, in fact, studying amnesia, and so I was benefited from wonderful advisors, Larry Squire and Andrew Mays, and also Art Shimura and Bill Jagus. We studied amnesia. It's, of course, we all may have sleep amnesia. Very few have the type of amnesia we studied, but it shed a lot of light on this fundamental distinction between declarative memory and non-declarative memory. The critical features that contribute to declarative memory allow us to have this conscious experience of memory retrieval. And I was also fortunate to have ERP advisors, Larry Squire and Marta Kudis, and one of the things I learned about with my first study in the ERP world was, or in cognitive neuroscience at all, was looking at memory formation. So you can present a bunch of stimuli. In this case, I've used photographs from my Venice High School yearbook because none of the students at Northwestern would have seen them. So you can learn these things, see faces, and then later on get a memory test. We go back and code which faces are remembered or forgotten, and that allows us to look at the EEG data and separately compare remembered and forgotten, subsequently remembered and forgotten. So this DM is what the term we use for the difference based on subsequent memory performance. And that can be done, of course, with fMRI. People tend to call this a subsequent memory effect, but that takes so many more words. So it's DM, and it makes you think that something really important is happening in that 1 second, after you see a stimulus, and how you remember it later. And I have one more thing to say about another mentor. So I can't talk about all my mentors, unfortunately, or I wouldn't have time for everything else. But one other mentor that deserves mentioning was actually from the same high school. I went to Venice High in LA, the LA City schools. Sometimes you just need one teacher in your schooling that's going to be so inspirational. And for me, it was Mr. Bacho. And I walked into high school and I didn't know that this one class was going to be so influential. It was my English class. And in the English class, we learned how to write, and we learned a lot of important literature, but he also introduced me to a bunch of other things like altered states of consciousness and meditation. And one of the papers we read in our English class was a neuropsychological paper by Norman Geschwin, published in Science, about the brain systems for language. And so he planted a seed there about my interest in cognitive science, early on. And I wish everyone had a Mr. Bacho in school. He's such a wonderful example of a great teacher and so important for learning. Now, when these high school pictures were taken, there was a guy shooting the photograph with a flashbulb. That's this little thing next to the camera in the old days. And so there's this idea of a flashbulb memory. If something really important and dramatic happens, seems like you stamp it into your brain immediately, right at that very moment, just like in this 500 milliseconds when the DM is measured. But that's not true. I mean, there are flashbulb memories, but nothing's learned instantaneously. That's not how learning works. It takes a lot more than that half a second of processing to store memory, at least I think it does. And therefore, we have to think more about how memory works. So back to the story, what determines which memories endure? It's more than just elaborative encoding right at that moment. It's practice. You have to practice to get good. You're learning a skill. It needs practice. Same applies for facts and episodes. And so that practice is both intentional when you're rehearsing and practicing something, but also unintentionally happening. And that's what got interesting for me when I started thinking more about consolidation. So here's a standard model of consolidation, my interpretation of it, that memories can be reactivated and then subsequently consolidation can happen. And in some Disney fashion, it seems to be happening like this, that you pull a memory orb off a shelf and you scroll through it and you can rehearse a memory and play it over and over again. But there aren't any little girls like that in your brain, and there aren't any memory orbs. Our memories aren't separate little things on shelves. They're all intermixed. It's inherent to consolidation, and that there are new connections formed. It's a transformation of information, because that's how information is stored effectively. It has to be connected to other things and integrated. And so when I think about the standard idea of consolidation, I sort of think, well, we don't need other words. We don't need to say it's transformation or evolution or reconsolidation. I think those are all encompassed in how we think about consolidation, at least by the traditional view, that there's many changes going on, potentially corruptions, as memories are processed. But it can lead to enduring memories. And the one additional point to it here is that that can happen during sleep, perhaps when we're completely unaware and unintentionally having that happen. And so that's what's got really interesting for me to think about memory processing, the importance of consolidation, and how sleep is contributing to that. Now, it has a long and checkered history, this idea of memory processing during sleep. First, of course, in fiction, it's been very interesting. Huxley talked about it, where a totalitarian government could control its citizens by presenting information during the sleep and making them think in a particular way that was good for the society according to their rules. I wrote about that in a paper I called Sleeping in a Brave New World. Just the ethics of this is a little tricky. An unethical hotel owner could surreptitiously play advertising to hotel guests, and we should be on guard for such a thing. You should be on guard about leaving the TV on all night while you're sleeping. That also is a little dangerous. But it's not only fiction. Almost 100 years ago, there was a real apparatus built to do this, where you could record any message of your own choice and play it back to yourself later to try to influence how your mind is working. But there's a confusing part. If we could just learn during sleep, that would be a great shortcut, and we wouldn't need to spend any effort. And that's what's made it tricky. We wrote about that with a paper with Delphine Oudiette, who's now got a great position at the Paris Brain Institute doing wonderful work in this area. We describe sleep learning kind of in two ways. So there is this idea of learning new things during sleep, and that's possible, but in very limited fashion. But also there's this offline component of learning. And that's what's really interesting, that if you're going to learn new things, while you're awake is the best time to do that. But it continues on, and it continues in offline components, both during sleep and during wake. And so that's an important thing to study, we think. But the history of it is mixed. It was studies, even in the 30s and 40s, there were studies. They maybe didn't measure EEG well enough to know whether people were really asleep. And so in 1956, a paper came out saying, well, that's all garbage. You can't actually learn anything in your sleep. And that led to this whole dark ages. It became a taboo among sleep researchers to study this learning during sleep idea, or in fact, studying anything having to do with cognitive processing during sleep. Yet, of course, there were interesting theories. My favorite, Jonathan Winston's, came out in '84, and he discussed how memory processing during sleep could be this offline processing that's really helpful for planning and thinking about what's important in your life. And of course, as was discussed earlier today in another symposium, there's evidence about replay in hippocampal place cells that became a basis for thinking about memory processing during sleep. But within the sleep research community, it was still very controversial. Bob Stickold was working really hard to push against that view, but it was difficult because a lot of researchers in sleep research didn't really accept the idea that memory could have anything to do with what's going on in sleep. Perhaps because there was an emphasis on linking it all to dreaming and perhaps to REM sleep. And now, during the last couple of decades, there's been a bit of a shift. And instead of the emphasis only on REM sleep, now there's a lot more thinking about slow wave sleep. And one of the papers that got us along in those lines was this paper by Bjorn Rasch and colleagues. And maybe you've heard about this. They presented spatial information in a rose odor context. And so you had to learn the locations of objects, and the odors could be then presented again during sleep. And here you can see a hypnogram. So there's light sleep, slow wave sleep, and then REM sleep, and that pattern continuing. So they presented the odors during REM sleep in some people, during slow wave sleep in others, and then measured retrieval in the morning. And their finding was that forgetting was reduced if the odor had been presented during sleep. That's this top one, the top bar graph there. So there was more forgetting without the odor, but there was reduced forgetting if the odor happened both during learning and during slow wave sleep. Not REM sleep, didn't work in that case, but it worked in slow wave sleep. And that, when we read that paper in the lab, we got very excited about that and started thinking about how to study that and decided, well, we would study it with auditory stimuli instead. And we replicated almost the very same finding. Auditory stimuli wasn't what the original investigators used because, again, in the sleep research community, there was this orthodox view that information is going to be blocked in every modality except olfaction because of blocking at the thalamus. And that was just sort of a belief that it wasn't going to get through. There was some evidence, actually in the ERP literature, there was evidence that it could be processed quite thoroughly in responses to names and so forth. But we went ahead and did this experiment with sound. Here's a quick run through of it. People learned 50 object location associations. So different objects, each with a different sound, each in a different location. And through repetition, they had to learn every location quite precisely. And then at that point, they went for an afternoon nap in the lab. And when they entered slow wave sleep, we very softly presented half of the sounds. 25 randomly selected sounds were presented. And the idea was these could reactivate those spatial memories. And when people woke up, they indeed were more accurate at remembering the locations from the objects that had been reactivated through the sounds during sleep. And so they're not remembering the meow sound, they know that. The meow is reactivating the object and its location, so that's forgotten letter. That seems to be really the only conclusion here, that memory activation during sleep changes memory storage so that there's a more effective retrieval as a function of that reactivation during sleep. And now there's a lot more evidence of that. This TMR method also allows us to think a little bit and study the neural mechanisms of this processing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But so this one finding in a science paper with not enough subjects shouldn't really be convincing. But now we have, thanks to Xiaosheng Hu, this meta-analysis, and clearly these effects are replicable. There are many studies in many different labs with lots of types of memory, and so we can kind of believe this result. But even if you're still skeptical, it's pretty interesting that there's a new multi-lab replication study being started, thanks to Gordon Feld. And with German funding, he's got money for the Many Beds project. So they'll be running this very same experiment with sounds during sleep, but in 10 different labs around the world, maybe 300 subjects will be run. We'll see if it replicates. And I think we'll see also if there are more things to learn about the individual differences and the results from that. So very interesting open science approach. And there are a number of researchers now working on this TMR method. We've organized a workshop called the International Sleep Replay Workshop. We're going to meet, I don't know, every 18 months now. If you're interested in this kind of work, look this up. It's a nice group of people using these sorts of methods. And we've learned various things from these attempts at replication and extension. For example, results vary. And not every memory test is as good as another test. Some aren't sensitive enough. So you can certainly not get the results you might expect if the memory test isn't the right kind of memory test for the purpose. Another thing we learned is you really don't want to disrupt sleep with these sounds. So again, you could try this at home, but if the sounds wake you up, it's not going to be very effective. And a study with Nathan Whitmore when he was a grad student really showed that quite clearly. He had a TMR study. Again, it has the same components. There's a learning component, a pre-sleep test, and then TMR during sleep, and another test, in this case for face name learning. And then the stimuli during sleep were the names, half of the names that they had learned, and we showed that they were better at recalling which face goes with which name, but only if there wasn't sleep disruption. And Nathan looked in the EEG after each sound and was able to document that if there was sleep disruption, if there was an arousal, that actually worsened memory rather than improving it. So it's quite important that in these studies with TMR, the sounds are delivered very quietly and in a way that doesn't disrupt sleep. Nathan decided to follow it up even further, and so he said, let's intentionally present the sounds too loud and then wake people up and see what that does. And he, in fact, did show that if the learning just happened recently and then you have this period of sleep, you can worsen memory by presenting the sounds too loud so that they reactivate the memory but also disrupt sleep. Very interesting finding, and cautions us about how we're going to do this work going forward. Time for a musical interlude now. I'll just take a breath. So this is a wonderful melody by my friend and colleague Paul Reber. He's invented this diagram balance melody, and he studied these sequential performance tasks in lots of different varieties, including this one here. He really deserves sort of royalties from the Guitar Hero people when they got this game going. And so I can't thank all of my colleagues and collaborators. It would take too long, but so Paul's going to be the representative one I'm going to thank, and I'm really grateful to him for collaborating and doing these experiments together. And then also 10 years ago, he decided, let's do a longitudinal study of skill learning in the field. And so this is his term for describing the idea that he suggested maybe I should go take piano lessons, and then I could play in his rock and roll band. So that was my first introduction to doing that. Thank you so much for that, Paul. We're still playing together. All right, but back to the study. So this was a study actually run by James Antoni. He was the one working between the two labs, between my lab and Paul Reber's lab. Got the study going. People had to do this Guitar Hero test. They practiced a couple melodies and got good at them compared to a control melody. And we made it a little bit more difficult for them, so they were making errors. And then everyone had a nap, and we randomly selected one of the melodies to play during sleep. And they got better in all the melodies. This often happens with this kind of skill learning, but they got more better for the one that got cued during sleep than the one they didn't. So again, the cue seems to be reminding you of the visual motor task that you've learned and making you better at doing that performance when you wake up. There are a number of interesting findings in this study from James. Another one was that there were spindles recorded over contralateral cortex, and the extent to which there were spindles correlated with the TMR benefit. And this has been building up. I mean, spindles have been known for decades, but now there's more and more literature showing that there may be really a sign of some of the memory processing that we're interested in studying, some of the thalamocortical processing. And another study that James did when he was a postdoc with Ken Norman looked further, and he showed that when you present these TMR cues, there's more likely to be spindles. And to the extent there are spindles, there's greater memory benefit. So that, again, links them with the processing. And another part of their study was that they noticed there's a rhythm, there's a refractory period on spindles. They're not happening too close together. And therefore, there's sort of an optimal time to present these sounds to do memory processing, because you don't want to present it right after a spindle. They did real-time spindle detection and then could optimize the presentation. Presenting the sounds at 3.5 seconds after spindle meant there was going to be another spindle and therefore a bigger memory effect. And so yet more evidence about the importance of spindles for memory. Right at about the same time, Scott Carney's group came up with another study using memory decoding from the EEG and also showing the relevance of spindles. And really, there's a ton of evidence now linking spindles that I can't summarize in the last few years, but let me talk about one study not yet published on spindles. And this is a study in people that have highly superior autobiographical memory. And you may have heard of these people. They can tell you something, what happened from virtually every day in their adult life. Not the whole story, but they seem to know which day of the week it was and what happened that day. Mary Lou Henner is one of the people here. There's a fun 60 minutes video where she describes all the things she can remember from her life. And one of the interesting features was they look at her closet at home. And she has this huge closet in LA with all these shoes, a couple hundred shoes, and each one she can walk up to it and point out what day of the week, what day she wore it last, and what she did on that day. That's the kind of incredible memory these people have. There may be 100 people that have been identified with this great ability, and Carmen and I seem to be the only ones studying them now, so we're recruiting some new ones who are contacting us. Pretty interesting, but a little curious about why is their memory so amazing? Well, perhaps they have really, like Mary Lou Henner's closet, maybe their brains are really well organized too. They have organized brains where these memories are kept. I think there's another role for reactivation. Are they reactivating these memories more often? Because it's all about rehearsal. They're reactivating these memories frequently. And so Carmen and I thought we'd look to see, well, let's see if their sleep is the same as everybody else's. Actually, it's not quite. And the way it's different, they have lots and lots of spindles. They have more spindles than age-matched people, and we're just finishing up this study, but I'm pretty confident in the results already. A lot of spindles, that's perhaps part of the story of why their memory is so good, and we need to think about that. How do we do that for the rest of us so we can do better with our sleep at night? Of course, it's not just spindles. So there's other physiology to look at, and I want to tell you about this recent study from Eitan Shexman, who was a postdoc in the lab and is now at UC Irvine. And he did a study where there were multiple objects to learn, but some of them linked to the same sound. So the normal study has one object, one sound, one object in a location, but he has some sounds that connect to 2 objects and others that connect to 6 objects. So on different trials, there might be 6 different cats in different locations, but they all go with the same meow. And so his question was, well, if we present that sound during sleep, it has to get distributed over 6 things. Maybe it's only 1/6 as effective, or 1/2 of effective in the sets of 2. And so what he found was not that. He found that the memory benefit is the same for all of these different conditions. So it seems like the sound can activate all these things at once, which for me is sort of an interesting feature. It means that this memory activation during slow wave sleep is probably unconscious. Now, sleep has this interesting thing that, if you wake up and you say, well, I don't remember a dream, 2 possibilities are there. You were unconscious and didn't have a dream, or you had one and you forgot. And it's hard to discriminate between those sometimes, but this sort of argues, no, I think in slow wave sleep, maybe this memory processing can happen without a bottleneck like conscious processing would, where there's only so many things you can process at once. Maybe you can process all kinds of things simultaneously in parallel, and that's perhaps the unconscious processing during sleep. And with Leila Davachi, we've been looking at that during wake. What's the difference between conscious reactivation and unconscious reactivation? And there's a lot more to do on that. We're just getting started, but this is part of it. Is there a bottleneck? Is there a limit on how many things you can process at once? Is there kind of a spreading activation that spreads to other things the way maybe it happens in sleep? And Eitan's been studying the role of context and how that spreading happens. Or is there instead an inhibition like in working memory where you activate one thing and you're inhibiting the other things? So we have to understand, how does conscious and unconscious memory activation differ? And how does awake reactivation differ from sleep reactivation? So these are still kind of open questions. But pretty interesting. The sleep reactivation, well, the physiology of the brain's quite different during sleep. So that really suggested something different. And here's one example from Eitan's study. He recorded, there's a time frequency plot. 0 is when the stimuli were presented. And so after a stimulus that's reactivating memories during sleep, there's an increase in slow wave activity and an increase in spindle activity. And these both scale with how many reactivations there are. In other words, this is a bigger effect if it's a sound linked with 6 objects compared to 2, compared to 1. So there's more of this processing happening. And so these are the critical features that we can measure of memory processing that I'm sure you've heard of. They're the slow waves. They're important. They're prominent in slow wave sleep. And they're probably not epiphenomenal like we used to maybe think about ERPs sometimes. The slow wave is really reflecting some important processing because it has an upstate and a downstate. And during the upstate, there's lots of activity synchronously across different parts of the cortex. Well, that's what you need for the cross-cortical interactions. For these interactions to happen, it's nice if all the cortical areas that are interacting are active at the same time. So there's a slow wave facilitation of memory processing, and it's helpful for the spindles to be happening at that same time. So that's why we need this coupling of the timing of the spindles relative to the slow waves. And of course, the third player here, the hippocampal sharp wave ripples. They all need to be timed well for this processing to happen. And so there's a whole lot of exciting work in this territory in humans and non-human studies. Let me just summarize rather than go into too much more. There are electrical signs of the relevant physiology. and in other cases, dysfunction. And well, we can't measure everything in humans, but these are some parts of the mechanism. And the slow waves and spindles and ripples and their coordination gives us a critical handle on this memory processing. The real action, we think, of course, during consolidation is that it's a change in memory storage. It's a hippocampal neocortex dialogue that allows altered storage as memory is changing over time, as you're basically integrating the new information and really working with it so that it becomes an enduring memory. Possible to study that in humans, very difficult. For example, Guillen Fernandez's group did this amazing study where people are sleeping in the scanner. There's EEG to record what stage they're in. They're presenting soft sounds in the loud scanner environment and keeping them in slow wave sleep. And they did see some indication of this hippocampal neocortical dialogue that's important for there. So it'd be nice to talk about more about the memory consolidation. There's a lot of exciting work yet to come to understand these mechanisms. Let me then summarize the other part. So what is your brain doing while you're sleeping? Well, the clear answer is while you're asleep, your brain is being cleaned up by house elves. That sort of encapsulates the idea. Actually, I wrote a paper with that title in this wonderful journal, Frontiers for Young Minds, that if you Google sleep and house elves, you can get it for free. It's for kids in learning about science. If you don't like the Harry Potter metaphor, we can just say it's memory organizing. So this memory organizing is happening overnight, and that's beneficial for having the memories you're likely to need for your ongoing decision making and usefulness in the future. And part of that usefulness is, of course, solving problems. So when you're reactivating memories and connecting different memories, there's an opportunity for creatively putting things together in a new way. And so we study that a little bit in a problem-solving kind of paradigm. This is from Mark Beeman's lab. So he has lots and lots of puzzles like this. This one is, can you move 3 of those circles and make the triangle point down instead of up? And so they studied these various problems, and we used it in the study by Kristen Sanders to look at the role of sleep. And everyone knows if you're making a decision, it's going to be helpful to sleep on it, to really make a good decision later, to give it some time. And why is that? It's probably because your brain can be unconsciously working on all the relevant information and putting it together and giving you an answer. So maybe it does actually benefit creativity, and this paper actually has results showing that. Here's the answer to that problem, to move those 3 dots. But we didn't want people to come up with the answers to these problems. So actually what Kristen did is gave people problem after problem until they failed to solve 6 of them. And so she had 6 unsolved problems at night, and each problem had a different soundtrack, different little melody that went with it. And then people went home and they had a device that allowed 3 of those soundtracks to be played during sleep. So you randomly pick 3 of those and reactivate those unsolved puzzles. And then when they wake up and they come into the lab the next day, they try to solve puzzles. They get a little more time, few more minutes to solve them. And if it's not cued during sleep, they solve about 20% of them. It goes over 30% if they got the cue. So clearly the cues are reactivating the problem and perhaps restructuring a little bit how you're working with the problem the next day. So, I mean, this would be great if we could come up with more creative solutions to all the problems we need to solve, wouldn't it? And this, of course, we don't know from this experiment, did it depend on REM sleep or slow wave sleep? We just know they woke up and then when they came to the lab, they solved the problems more often. So a lot of questions, but you know, this idea of creativity is right adjacent to dreaming. I mean, does anyone think they're not creative? Because I tell you, your dreams are incredible, and we all have that capability to be really creative. In fact, you know, it seems like right now you're sitting in this room and you're able to have this experience of being in this room, and it kind of seems like it's coming from the sensory world. But it's all coming from your head, because you can have the very same experience in your dream without the sensory input. And it's so real that you usually think you're not dreaming. You have dreams and they're non-lucid dreams because you think you're awake until you think you're awake until you actually wake up and then realize you were dreaming the whole time. So we've been studying lucid dreaming. That's when you have a dream and you know you're dreaming in the course of dreaming, rather than having to wait till you wake up. And we've used a variant on our TMR method called targeted lucidity reactivation that can promote lucid dreaming. Many people never have a lucid dreams. It's quite rare in a lot of people. but we can make it happen in someone who's never had one before. One of the important features is pre-sleep training. So there's a training protocol linking with a sound, and then we play that sound during REM sleep. And here you can see at time 1, the sound came in, and that prompted the person to think carefully about their experience and actually come to the conclusion that they were dreaming. And they knew, okay, if I'm dreaming, I make a left-right signal with my eyes. And that allowed them to communicate to us that they were having a lucid dream, and then we could now study that phenomenon further. And so one of the things we've done, led by Karen Konkoly and with groups from 3 other countries, we showed that real-time communication could happen with this procedure during REM sleep. Now, here's a wake EEG on the left, and then in red, it's a period of REM, and you can tell it's REM. There's muscle atonia. The EMG is really low. No one's talking in their REM sleep. Their body's not moving, but your eyes can move, and your respiration works. And so with the eyes moving, this person signaled to us, I'm having a lucid dream. And at that point, Karen issued a question. He knew, the sleeper knew he was going to get a question. He didn't know which one, a math question he could answer. And so he heard the question, and amazingly, during REM sleep, was able to take it in, compute the answer, and give us the answer too. And then and we've repeated this in other people. It's possible to have this communication. Here's a little cartoon of it. The question comes out. You're dreaming something with, some windows and lights, and yet you can realize you're actually in a laboratory sleeping and can signal the answer. We don't really want to know the answer to math problems, but that was just to show that we could do the method. Now we're using lots of other signals. People can make eye movements, they can do muscle twitches, and we like them doing sniffs. We measure that with the nasal cannula, and they go or whatever, a number of sniffs to give us a coded answer to our questions. And so now dreamers can now tell us. This is really a new era for dream research. Dreamers can tell us what they're dreaming about at the moment they're dreaming about it, rather than just when they wake up later, which is a problematic method if the only thing you have. And we can assign them tasks. So in Karen's dissertation, she's been asking a lot of questions about dreams, problem solving, and allowing us to communicate with the people while they're dreaming. So we're adding to the literature in lucid dreaming in this way with these new methods. And of course, it's always important to think about the literature and be sure you're covering the things that are relevant from the past. And it turns out there's a lucid dreaming literature that goes back about 900 years that we learned about. It's about a contemplative practice during REM sleep. There are various types of meditation. You can have a focused attention meditation, but there's also analytic sorts of meditation. And there's a very advanced type of meditation that people do not when they're awake, but when they're asleep. And there's a well-documented Buddhist tradition looking at this, using dreaming to gain spiritual insights. It's called dream yoga, but it's not about physical poses. It's about mental exercises that people are doing. And Gabriella and Daniel have been studying this. And we're looking at it to see there insights we can get from it. Can we understand what they're doing? They're actually doing it in REM sleep. We've documented it. It's happening while they're in REM sleep. And can we understand those methods and maybe have some ideas that could be used in non-meditators and any of us to get more out of our sleep and do tasks during sleep? Another interesting facet of this work is that we have collaborators. Some of them are skilled meditators, and some of the other ones are Buddhist scholars like monks and nuns who are very knowledgeable both about the Buddhist philosophy and psychology and about cognitive neuroscience. They've been learning about neuroscience through a wonderful program called the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. And here we are at the Science Center in India. So many monks and nuns have taken the science classes, including our neuroscience classes, and we've been very privileged to be involved with Emory University on that. And it's moved ahead now to 10 of the monks and nuns have come to Evanston and work in my lab and Marcia's lab and Robin Nussak's lab to get hands-on experience for a couple months, learn the methods. Here you can see a few of the monks with Karen doing overnight sleep studies. So now they have the skills to do these studies, and we've built a lab in the Science Center with sleep recordings. So these studies of lucid dream are now going on in their hands, and they're having this is just like having PhD students. Now they have the tools to do whatever research they want to do in the future and take it to a new level. So that's really very exciting. But I'm getting near the end here, so let me see. I talked about TMR as a research tool to study memory consolidation, but interestingly, there may be some practical usefulness of these methods too in other contexts to amplify the benefits of sleep. And to do that, we need to take this work out of the laboratory and into your bedroom, because that's where we need to do these studies if it's going to work. Nathan has done some work replicating the spatial TMR benefit, and he showed that it can be done overnight while people are sleeping in their own homes. They're wearing just a wrist monitor that can control the sounds from a smartphone, present the sounds, and be sure they're not too loud. And we monitored that with EEG from a headband to verify that it's happening in stage 3 sleep most of the time, and can get these effective things. Now, we don't have everything set to test these methods to see what can be done, but we're very eager to see how that can work. And let me give you some examples of what you can do right now before these methods are ready, because probably you know all about sleep hygiene. You know, there are various methods you can use. You can wear one of these things and get better sleep, wear a mask, and it's really helpful to, well, anyway, there are various helpful methods. I'm not going to go through them all because I'm out of time, but have a look at those if you're not familiar with them. These can be simple behavioral things you can do to get better sleep. But now we're talking about the future sleep. So we want to think, well, not instead of, but in addition to sleep hygiene, what else can we do? And how can we use methods to do sleep engineering, to actually make sleep work better in a kind of a sci-fi sense? It's not the old-fashioned, you know, before we had glasses, you know, the world was a lot different. And now we have glasses. And imagine sleep before glasses. It's like you just lay down on the pillow and maybe you'd have a good night's sleep. Well, with sleep engineering, we can maybe really construct better sleep and in the future have that work better. So it's not just monitoring sleep with the monitoring devices, which, by the way, can be really problematic if you have sleep anxiety and you're worried about it. Not a good idea. But other than that, you can use these monitoring devices to go one step further and do kind of stimulation that might help improve memory or creative problem solving or psychological well-being. So I remember I was saying we have sleep-based memory consolidation, and if you're organizing memories, which memories are you reactivating each night? Because who's picking which ones you're going to reactivate? Well, the choice can have repercussions for your psychological well-being. So think about it this way. You're there sleeping, and it's sleep impacting your waking life, but the sleep cognition part is really important. So not just how much slow-wave sleep and REM you're getting, but which memories you're activating during those times from the day. The good ones you had that day or the other ones you had that day. Like if it's the negative ones, then perhaps that negativity is really transferring to your daytime and producing more problems. So put another way, if your wake is filled with a lot of depressing thoughts that are just impinging on you and overwhelming you, probably those thoughts are coming up during your sleep as well. And those can go back and hurt you again. So we have to worry about that. You might have any sort of negative thoughts, and you can take a strategy like CBT and try to dampen that. But if our strategies are only focused on wake, they're not really hitting the whole problem. We really should also be thinking about what's happening during sleep. So here's a fun future possibility. And Jess Payne and I have been thinking a lot about this and working on some possibilities. What if we present some cues during sleep that move you more towards calm thoughts or relaxing thoughts or pro-social thoughts? Those could change and kind of tweak the kind of thinking you're doing so that instead of having this anxious sleep, you might have calm sleep. And then we can approach that and try to make things better during the waking time. And I don't know if it's true for you, but sometimes we get a bit anxious about things that are happening, and it'd be nice to be able to calm that down a little bit, not just in your waking state, but in your sleep too. So these are the opportunities for sleep engineering with wearable technology. Of course, as a memory researcher, I'm thinking first, well, how can we improve memory in certain cases? And of course, any therapy like stroke rehab that is about learning new strategies, can we make those work better? As I was just alluding to, there are sleep habits and ideas of sleep quality that could be improved in a number of ways. So with this new funding we're fortunate to get from NIH, we're looking at all these options for how we can use TMR and other methods to try to improve sleep habits and sleep quality, and as well lucid dreaming. Now, the companies that make these wearables they're also going to do some research, but they might mostly be thinking about the anecdotal evidence. So we really need, of course, solid findings to know which of these methods are worthwhile, which ones are working. And so it's great to have this funding for such research to make that work rather than depending on the industry to do that. And of course, we need the basic research to understand the sleep physiology, and that will inform the development of these approaches. And I've listed here lots of different potential applications. So there's really a lot more exciting research to be done. And so I'm encouraged that more and more laboratories are looking at this. And if you have a laboratory with EEG, pretty much you have what you need to do the sleep research too, and you could go and do these sorts of studies. So I hope a lot of people are going to be doing that. And just as a last note, speaking about a lot of people, I'm thinking that political mass activism is something we also need to really think about outreach for science and making these points more clear to the general public and the potential usefulness of these things. But I see my time is about up, so I will thank my students and collaborators and mentors again, and my funding agencies, and the Cognitive Neuroscience Society for this award. Thank you very much for your attention as well.